In the last video, I talked about how basically evil people are using our sign making and sign interpretation systems to grab power, grab money for themselves, and to doom us really as a society. But this is something that we all confront every day, the use of signs and the observations of semiotics. And what I'm going to talk about here is why the left is somewhat behind in coming up and using this for their the goals, at least of collective liberation, of egalitarianism. And so we'll talk a little bit about more generally why semiotics is being overlooked, and then talk more specifically about why the left has a problem in understanding its role. And as I observed in that last video, part of the reason is that in general, the social sciences, whatever their political orientation, which are trying to understand society truthfully, have nevertheless not observed their embeddedness in semiotics, and our embeddedness in semiotics as the molecules of meaning, the molecules of communication, even though linguistics has a segment of it that is about semiotics. It's a very, very small segment of linguistics. But in any case, the implications of that have not been fully explored. And even as I mentioned there, Umberto Eco, a semiotician, did not make the connection, in my opinion, clearly enough with how fascists use our sign-making needs, our sign-making dependence to grab power. And one of the more weird things about our political life is that the left, even though people on the left think of themselves as political people, that there is no systematic theory of politics really on the right or the left, but the left is particularly disadvantaged in the area of politics, in part because parts of the left, or the intellectual tradition of the left, has discounted politics itself and some other features of culture. So this is in part because of the Marxist tradition. So Marx had a theory of society where the economy, as he described it, was the base, and then everything else is the superstructure, or the that is depends on the foundation, the base of the economy. So the economy is prior to the politics, is prior to culture, prior to education, so forth and so on. So this is a view of society where you're emphasizing that people are overlooking the economic determinants of all these other things up there. And there you do gain insight from that. I think it's a very important perspective, but it's not the only perspective that you need to have as someone on the left. So this is a famous quote of Marx where he talks about how the struggle between classes in the base is determining history. So history is not determined by politics, is not determined by religion or other things. It's determined by class struggle. And in the typical class struggle in the Marxist framework, the one that he formulated as the bourgeoisie was coming into its own as a class in the early 19th century, that it was a struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the landless workers, or the not only landless, but mostly propertyless workers, and the property-owning bourgeoisie. And the particular property that they own were the means of production, the way to make other things. So the capital goods, the machinery, and there's also another class, the landowners, that from which many of the bourgeoisie came from. Not only there were other bourgeoisie came from skilled workers, among other things, and masters, and so forth and so on in the 18th and 19th century. But anyway, the property owning classes generally have shared many interests, including political interests, but also economic interests. And so the interest of the bourgeoisie is to lower wages. The interest of the proletariat is to raise wages. And this is part of the class conflict that we see going on continuously in our society. And a class analysis is really important to have. It's not the only tool that we need as the left. But in any case, Yanis Varoufakis offers a very incisive and interesting and important theory about our current society that is really, we're heading toward, or we are in a techno-feudalist society. So this is, Marx also had a model of class conflict in the feudal society that predated capitalism, and Yanis uses essentially a Marxist analysis or a neo-Marxist analysis to understand our current societies. And I would endorse a view of class conflict as being very relevant right now, because we have an extreme difference in wealth, and we have billionaires essentially owning governments now in many countries, and the billionaires have an eliminationist ideology, an ideology where they don't care about the rest of humanity. They essentially are trying to get rid of most of us, or many of us. They want to reduce our population. They don't really believe in biological human beings. They want to become transcendental or beings that are partly mechanical or totally mechanical, or they at least want to rely on robots and so forth and so on, and artificial intelligence. So this particular Taylor Rent's video is a good introduction to that. Now, Marx's political theory really was one of the inevitability of communism, that class conflict would take care of politics and so forth and so on. But as it turns out, it doesn't work that way. And so you have a various series of improvisations by the followers of Marx's theory, the social democratic parties, and then the communist parties that emerged in the 20th century, including Lenin and others improvising in terms of how to create a politics that would create a revolution in the spirit of communism. In the end, though, none of them has a theory of the state that is democratic, liberatory, and is something that people would want to follow now. That the Soviet Union was a failure as an example to the world, and also you have other regimes that are communist, nominally, nevertheless are not following Marxist theory in terms of the economy, certainly, even though there are some features, for instance, of Vietnam and China and so forth and so on, that are actually working pretty well for the economy of those societies, even though there are things that we wouldn't want to replicate here or in other countries that are used to a democratic system. And you see here the improvisation involved in the series of economic policies that after the Bolshevik Revolution, war communism, then new economic policy, then Stalin's first 5-year plan. So, and you had sort of a command economy that was created, and then that eventually collapsed in 1991, and that was, or before that, but then actually, and you were left with a people not having any idea about how to organize a society that was caring for people, that was liberatory, that was egalitarian, classless, or class reduced, let's say. And so without a theory of politics, and also I would say without understanding the semiotic basis of politics, not only Marxists, but other people on the left are left without a clear way to organize their politics, organize their economic policy that is based in reality, but also is something that brings people further toward the goals, the ideals that they hold. And I would say the ideas of Karl Polanyi, where the economy is embedded in society, is a good place to start.